You've had that money sitting there doing nothing for years, Dad. It's time you handed it over, while you can still sign your name. My son said that standing in my own kitchen, the kitchen where I'd taught him to crack an egg with one hand, beside him, his wife Vanessa folded her arms and studied the cabinets like she was already pricing them for a listing. My granddaughter Sophie stood frozen by the refrigerator, 15 years old, and staring at her father like she'd never seen him before. I set my coffee mug down slowly, and for a long moment I said nothing at all. 40 years of drafting the very documents people hope you've forgotten how to read will teach you something useful. Silence is a tool, not a weakness. I looked at my son, then at the manila folder Vanessa was already sliding across my counter, and I said quietly, "Then let's talk about what my name is actually worth. Before I tell you what happened after that, and what was waiting inside an envelope my son never saw coming, take a second to like this video and subscribe if you believe a parent's love should never be mistaken for a blank check. Tell me in the comments what you would have done if your own child tried to collect an inheritance from you while you were still very much alive. And let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment. My name is Walter Reams. I'm 71 years old, and for 38 years I practiced trust and estate law in the same mid-sized firm, 2 blocks off the courthouse square. I drafted wills for factory owners and farmhands, structured trusts for people who didn't trust their own children, and watched more times than I can count what happens to a family when money arrives before grief has finished its work. I always believed I understood that danger well enough to keep it out of my own house. I was wrong about that, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The house on Birchwood Court was never grand. 2 stories, brick the color of weak tea, a front porch that sagged a half-inch on the left where my late wife Eleanor used to sit every evening with her tea going cold beside her because she was too busy talking to notice it. We bought it the year I passed the bar exam, back when I was clerking for a judge who paid me barely enough to cover the mortgage, and Eleanor was teaching second grade for even less. We didn't buy it because it was impressive. We bought it because Eleanor stood in the empty living room, ran her hand along the exposed brick of the fireplace, and said, "This place has honest bones, Walter. So do we. That should be enough." It was enough. For 39 years, we raised our son Bradley in that house. I remember him at 6, sprawled on the living room floor, building courtrooms out of Lincoln logs, sentencing his stuffed animals to timeouts with a gavel made from a wooden spoon. I remember thinking foolishly that a boy who plays at justice grows into a man who respects it. Eleanor used to laugh at me for that. "He plays doctor sometimes too, Walter," she'd say. "That doesn't mean he's going to grow up caring whether anyone's actually sick." She was gentler with him than I ever was, and sharper about him than I ever managed to be. We scraped for every dollar of Bradley's education. I took on estate work I didn't love because it paid steadily. Eleanor tutored neighborhood kids on weekends for gas money. We never told him how many nights we sat at that kitchen table with the checkbook open between us, doing math that didn't want to work. We wanted him to believe the road was smoother than it was. That's what parents do. We iron the wrinkles out of the world before we hand it to our children, and then we're surprised, years later, when they don't understand why the fabric feels rough in our own hands. For a long time, Bradley called every Sunday. He came home for Thanksgiving and fell asleep on the couch the way he had as a boy, sprawled sideways with one arm hanging off the cushion. Then he met Vanessa Cole at a business conference in Chicago, and something in him began, slowly, to recalibrate. I want to be fair to Vanessa, because fairness was my profession for 4 decades, and I don't intend to abandon it now, even in my own story. She was polished, ambitious, quick with a compliment that always seemed to double as an appraisal. The first time she visited Birchwood Court, She walked the perimeter of the living room, commenting on square footage and bones. My late wife's word, emptied out and repurposed, before she'd so much as asked me a single question about my life. Bradley watched her do it and beamed like a man showing off a prize catch. Eleanor caught my eye across the room that day. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Eleanor's cancer diagnosis came 11 months after Bradley and Vanessa's wedding. It moved fast, faster than any of the doctors expected, faster than I was prepared to grieve. In the final weeks, Bradley visited less than either of us, hoped, always with an explanation wrapped in a reasonable voice. A client emergency, a flight delay, a conference he absolutely could not reschedule. I never told Eleanor how many nights she asked whether he'd called, and I lied and said he would call tomorrow. 3 days before she died, Eleanor took my hand in the hospice bed and said the only thing about the house or the money she ever said to me directly. Walter, whatever happens after I'm gone, don't let guilt make your decisions for you. Guilt is expensive, and it never once bought anybody peace. I promised her I wouldn't. I have spent every day since trying to keep that promise, and I have to tell you honestly, it is a harder promise to keep than any I ever wrote into a contract. She'd been gone 2 years when Bradley called to say he and Vanessa wanted to come home for a while. Sophie missed me, he said. They were worried about me rattling around that big house alone. It would just be temporary, he said, just until they got back on their feet after a rough stretch. I want to tell you I hesitated. I didn't. I said yes before he'd finished the sentence, because for 2 years that house had been so quiet. I sometimes talked to Eleanor's photograph just to hear a voice that wasn't my own. They moved in on a Saturday in March. Sophie ran across the yard and hugged me so hard I nearly lost my footing, and for about 11 days it felt like something had been given back to me that I thought I'd lost for good. The first sign came quietly, the way these things almost always do. It was a Tuesday, 10 days after they'd moved in. I came downstairs to find Vanessa at the kitchen table, with my investment statements spread in front of her. The quarterly summaries from the account Eleanor and I had built over 3 decades. Modest by some standards, but not small. The account that had always simply sat and grown, untouched, meant eventually for Sophie's college, and whatever came after that for Bradley. Just getting a feel for where everything stands, Vanessa said, not looking up. Bradley mentioned you don't always keep close track of these things anymore. I had drafted more trust documents than most attorneys see in 3 careers, and I had never in my life not kept close track of my own money. I said as much, politely. Vanessa smiled, the particular smile of someone filing information away rather than receiving a correction, and changed the subject to the price of homes 2 streets over. I should have called Denise Okafor that same week. I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid. The occupational hazard of a man who spent his career watching families come apart over exactly this kind of thing. I told myself my son was not the men I used to write contracts to protect people from. I was, as it turned out, about 30% right about that, which in my old profession we would have called a very expensive margin of error. By the second week of April, the small requests had become a pattern I recognized from the other side of 100 conference tables. Bradley asked, almost in passing, whether I'd ever considered simplifying my finances by adding him to a few accounts, just for convenience, just in case. He asked whether the trust Eleanor and I had set up years ago was still the most efficient structure, using a phrase I was fairly certain he'd learned from someone else, because Bradley had never in his life used the word efficient to describe anything but a golf swing. Sophie was the one who told me, without meaning to reveal anything, what was actually going on. We were in the garage on a Saturday afternoon sorting through boxes of Eleanor's old classroom supplies, and Sophie said, out of nowhere, Mom's design studio is in trouble, isn't it? It wasn't really a question. I asked her what made her think that. She shrugged. 15 years old and already better at reading a room than most adults, I'd deposed. They fight about money every night. I hear them through the wall. That was the first thread. It would take me another 6 weeks to see the whole tapestry. The dinner happened on a Thursday in early May, 6 weeks after they'd moved in. Bradley called it a family planning conversation. A phrase engineered, I suspected, by someone whose job it was to make hard asks sound soft. He'd invited a man named Marcus Feld to join us. A wealth transition consultant, Bradley explained. Someone who specialized in helping families move assets efficiently between generations. Marcus arrived in a blazer that cost more than my first car and shook my hand with the confident, overwarm grip of a man selling something he hadn't yet named. We sat in the living room, the same room where I'd once watched my 6-year-old son sentence a stuffed rabbit to 30 days for stealing cookies. Marcus opened a leather folder. Inside were documents I recognized instantly for what they were, even before he explained them. An early distribution request against the family trust, structured to release a significant portion of the principal now, while I was, in Marcus's careful phrasing, still able to participate meaningfully in the planning process. How much? I asked, because 40 years of practice had taught me that vague generosity always hides a specific number. Marcus glanced at Bradley. Bradley glanced at Vanessa. Vanessa answered for both of them. 180,000, she said. It would stabilize the studio and let us breathe. We'd pay it back, obviously, out of Bradley's share down the line. I looked at my son. Down the line is a phrase I've heard from 100 clients' children, and it has never once, in my experience, referred to an actual line. This isn't about the money, Dad, Bradley said, which is a sentence I have never once heard spoken by a man for whom it was not, in fact, entirely about the money. It's about family helping family. You always taught me that. I had, in fact, taught him that. I had also taught him, or thought I had, that family, helping family runs in more than one direction, and that a parent's savings are not a line of credit extended automatically at birth. I told them I'd need time to review the documents properly, the same sentence I'd advised 1,000 clients to say when someone tried to rush a signature. Marcus's smile flickered, just slightly, at the word review. I filed that away. That night, I finally called Denise. Denise Okafor had been my law partner for 22 years before I retired, and she was sharper at 73 than most attorneys I knew at 40. She answered on the second ring, the way she always had, and when I explained what was happening, she was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Walter, tell me you haven't signed anything." "Not yet," I said. "Good. Don't. And Walter, I want you to pull the original trust documents, all of them, including the amendment we did after Eleanor's diagnosis. Do you remember what's in that amendment?" I did remember vaguely, the way you remember a document you drafted years ago under grief's fog rather than clear focus. Denise told me to find it before I did anything else, and to call her the moment I had it in front of me. I hung up the phone with my hands not entirely steady, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I understood that I was not merely being asked for help. I was being tested for how much I would give up before I noticed I was giving anything up at all. The next 3 weeks were an education in exactly how far the pressure could stretch without ever once raising its voice. Week 1. Bradley began managing the household bills, setting up autopay on accounts I'd handled myself for 30 years, always framed as a kindness. "One less thing for you to worry about, Dad." I noticed, a few days later, that the primary contact email on 2 of those accounts had quietly become his. Week 2. Vanessa mentioned, twice in one dinner, how much peace of mind it would give the family if I updated my power of attorney to name Bradley as sole agent instead of Denise, who'd held that role since Eleanor's illness. Denise is wonderful, but she's not blood, Vanessa said, as though blood were a credential and 40 years of loyalty were not. Week 3 brought the real escalation, and it came on what I now think of with the specificity Denise had trained into me decades earlier, as day 22. I came home from a walk to find a realtor's card on the kitchen counter. A woman named Priya Bhatt, from a firm specializing in what her card called senior transition properties. I asked Sophie quietly whether she knew anything about it. Sophie's face did something complicated. Dad had someone come look at the house last week, she said, while you were at your doctor's appointment. He said it was just to get an idea of what it's worth. He said you didn't need to know yet because it might upset you. It did upset me. It also told me, with a clarity that felt almost like relief after weeks of vague unease, exactly what I was dealing with. That same week, I found the file Eleanor's old investment ledger, a habit she'd kept from her years managing the school's small activity fund. Meticulous handwritten notes she'd stopped keeping only when the digital statements made it seem redundant. Sorting through her old desk drawer for something else entirely, I came across a page from 8 years earlier, a note in her careful cursive, discrepancy, $45,000. B says bank error, will follow up. Beneath it, in a different colored ink, added weeks later, bank says no record of correction request. Ask again. I sat at that desk for a long time. I remembered now that the page had jogged it loose. A stretch, 8 years back, when Bradley had come to us in what he called a temporary cash crunch from a failed first business venture, and we'd both assumed, that the shortfall we noticed afterward in the joint investment account was simply a processing error, because our son had told us it was, and because believing our son was, at the time, a great deal easier than doubting him. I photographed the page with my phone before I did anything else. Then I called Denise again. I told her, my son has done this before. Denise didn't sound surprised, which somehow made it worse. Walter, she said, bring me everything, the ledger page, the trust amendment, and anything you have about this realtor and this Marcus Feld. I want to see the whole picture before we talk to anyone. I met her at her office 2 days later. Her firm still occupied the same brick building near the courthouse, and her assistant still kept a coffee pot that hadn't been replaced since the Clinton administration. Denise read through everything I brought her with the same unhurried thoroughness I remembered from 3 decades of watching her work, and when she finally looked up, her expression was the one she used to reserve for opposing counsel who'd just made a mistake they didn't know they'd made. Walter, she said, do you remember why we amended the trust after Eleanor's diagnosis? I remembered the broad strokes, protecting the principal, ensuring it couldn't be touched without specific safeguards. But the details had blurred under the weight of grief I was carrying at the time I signed it. Denise turned the amendment around so I could read it myself. You and Eleanor built in a spendthrift provision, she said, specifically triggered by demonstrated financial mismanagement or unauthorized withdrawal from trust assets. If a beneficiary is shown to have taken funds without authorization, the way it looks like Bradley did 8 years ago, the trust automatically restricts that beneficiary's access to any future distribution until an independent review is completed and restitution is made. You wrote this provision yourself, Walter. Eleanor asked you to build in a lock. Nobody in this family could talk their way around, even you. She told me once she was afraid that if it ever came to it, your love for Bradley would be exactly the weakness someone could use against you. I sat in that office for a long moment, feeling something I can only describe as the particular grief of realizing your dead wife understood your family more clearly, from her hospice bed, than you had in 2 subsequent years of living inside it. There's some Denise said. Marcus Feld's firm called my office 6 weeks ago. Someone identifying himself as representing your family asked about procedures for accelerating an irrevocable trust distribution and whether a beneficiary could contest a spendthrift clause. We didn't give out any information, obviously. You're still the trustee, and no one had authorization to inquire on your behalf. But Walter, that call came in 8 days before your son and his family moved into your house. That was the detail that finally rearranged the entire picture in my mind. This had never been a spontaneous request, born of a rough financial patch. It had been planned, weeks in advance, before a single box had been carried through my front door. I want to tell you, I felt only anger. I felt that, yes, a cold, clean anger, unlike anything I'd experienced in 4 decades of watching other families do exactly this to each other. But underneath it, I felt something closer to grief. The particular grief of understanding that the son who used to sentence stuffed rabbits to justice in my living room had grown into a man willing to let his own daughter grow up. Watching him try to take a house out from under his father before that father was even gone. Denise gave me clear instructions before I left her office. Don't confront them yet. Don't sign anything. Document everything you observe. Dates, conversations, anything left in the open. Let them show you the rest of the plan. Because people who believe they've already won tend to stop hiding it. She turned out to be exactly right. Over the following 2 weeks, the pieces I needed arrived faster than I expected. Mostly because Bradley and Vanessa, believing they were close to success, stopped being careful. I overheard the first call by accident, coming downstairs early one morning for coffee. Bradley's voice carried from the den, tight and low in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager caught in a lie. The studio can't make payroll past next month, he was saying. I told you, Marcus is handling the trust side. Once that clears, we're fine. It's not complicated, it's just slow. A pause. Then, quieter. He doesn't suspect anything. He never does. I stood very still in the hallway. He never does. 40 years spent teaching other people's children not to underestimate their parents, and I had, apparently, spent 6 weeks proving I could be underestimated myself. The second piece came from Sophie, 2 days later, in the garage again, where it seemed increasingly to be the only room in the house, where anyone told me the truth. Grandpa, she said, not looking up from the box she was sorting, I heard Dad on the phone with Mr. Feld. He said something about, I think it was called a forfeiture clause. He sounded really upset about it, like he already knew about it and was hoping you didn't. That told me 2 things at once. First, that Bradley already knew, or at least suspected, exactly what the trust amendment contained, which meant every conversation about helping family had been staged around a fact he was deliberately withholding. Second, that Marcus Feld's firm had somehow gotten further information than Denise's office had given them, which meant they'd found it elsewhere, likely through the same investment company that managed the trust's underlying accounts, a firm I'd need to have a very direct conversation with once this was over. The third piece, the physical evidence Denise had told me to gather, came from my own desk, where I finally located, in the same file box as Eleanor's ledger, copies of 2 wire authorization forms from 8 years earlier, bearing a signature that was close to mine, but was not, in fact, mine. I had signed thousands of documents in my career. I knew my own signature the way I knew my own handwriting. And this was a careful, close imitation, not the genuine article. I photographed both forms and sent them straight to Denise. Her response came within the hour. Walter, this isn't just a family dispute anymore. This is potential forgery. I want you to come in tomorrow. And Walter, I think it's time we had a family meeting on our terms, not theirs. Take a second here, if you're still with me, and tell me in the comments. If you found out someone in your own family had forged your signature, Would you confront them privately first, or would you want witnesses in the room? I've heard both arguments made in my career, and I chose the second one for reasons that will become clear. The family meeting happened on a Sunday evening, 2 months to the day after Bradley and Vanessa had moved in. Bradley called it, once again, a planning conversation. The same soft phrase Marcus had used at the first dinner, which told me they still believed they were the ones controlling the room. We gathered in the living room. Bradley and Vanessa sat together on the couch, a fresh folder of paperwork between them. Sophie sat in the armchair by the window, quiet, watchful, the way she'd been watchful for weeks. Marcus Feld arrived at 4 in the same expensive blazer, carrying documents that had, this time, an actual dollar figure typed across the top. $400,000, structured as an accelerated distribution against the trust principle. We're not asking you to decide anything tonight, Bradley said, in the reasonable voice he'd clearly rehearsed. We just need you to understand where things stand. I understand exactly where things stand, I said, and something in my tone made Vanessa's eyes narrow slightly. I've spent the last several weeks reviewing the trust your mother and I built. I'd like to walk through a few things with you, if you don't mind. Bradley's expression didn't change. Not yet. But Marcus's did. A small, professional flicker of recalculation, the look of a man who has just realized the client he was managing might not, in fact, be the naive old man he'd been briefed to expect. At exactly 5 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I'd asked Denise to arrive precisely then, not a minute earlier. I wanted Bradley to lay out his full request first, on the record, in front of witnesses. Before anyone else entered the room, Denise walked in carrying a single leather folder and an envelope, cream-colored, unmarked, sealed. Bradley's face lit up the moment he saw it. I watched the calculation cross his features in real time, watched him assume, the way people assume when they've spent weeks building a story around the ending they want, that the envelope in Denise's hand contained exactly what he'd asked for. Walter asked me to bring some documentation, Denise said, settling into the chair I'd placed for her, directly across from Bradley. Given the size of the request on the table, I thought it was important everyone understand exactly what's inside the trust your mother built, Bradley, and what conditions apply to it. She opened the leather folder first. The trust amendment, the spendthrift provision laid out in the same careful language I'd drafted with Eleanor's insistence 8 years ago. Bradley's confidence held for the first 2 paragraphs. It began to falter on the third, when Denise read the exact clause restricting distribution in the case of demonstrated unauthorized withdrawal. That doesn't apply here, Bradley said too quickly. This is a completely different situation. Is it? Denise said, and it wasn't a question. She reached into the envelope. Inside was not a transfer authorization. It was not a check, not a release of funds, not anything close to the $400,000 Bradley had spent 2 months maneuvering to request. It was a formal notice. Copies of the 2 wire authorizations from 8 years earlier, the forensic signature comparison Denise had commissioned that week from an examiner she'd worked with for 30 years, and a letter on Denise's firm letterhead stating plainly that the trust's independent trustee, a role Denise herself had quietly assumed authority over that same week, using a provision in the original document that allowed her to step in if she believed the primary trustee's judgment was being compromised, was formally invoking the spendthrift clause, restricting any distribution to Bradley pending a full accounting of the 8-year-old withdrawal, and reserving the family's right to pursue restitution. Bradley opened that envelope, smiling. I watched the smile hold for exactly as long as it took him to read the first line. It did not survive the second. "This is insane," he said, standing up so fast the folder on his lap slid to the floor. "You're accusing me of forging Dad's signature over something that happened 8 years ago?" I'm not accusing you of anything, Bradley, Denise said, calm as still water. The documents are accusing you. I'm simply the one who found them. Vanessa's face had gone through several expressions in the space of 30 seconds. Confusion, then something sharper, something that looked unmistakably like genuine shock. 8 years ago, she said slowly, looking at her husband. Bradley, that's before we were even married. What withdrawal? The room went very quiet. I realized, watching Vanessa's face, that whatever she had known about the current push for early inheritance, and she had clearly known plenty, she had not known about this. Her husband had built an entire architecture of pressure over the previous 2 months, and somewhere underneath it sat a secret he'd kept even from the woman standing beside him at every turn. It's not what it looks like, Bradley said, but the sentence had nothing behind it. 40 years of practicing law had taught me exactly what an unsupported denial sounds like, and that was the sound of one. Then tell us what it looks like, I said. It was the first thing I'd said since Denise arrived, and my voice, to my own surprise, came out level and unhurried. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you took $45,000 from a joint account your mother and I built with 30 years of careful work, forged one of our signatures to cover it, let your mother spend her final year on this earth, still worrying quietly about a discrepancy she never solved, and then came back 8 years later to try for 400,000 more, using your wife's struggling business as the reason and your own daughter as a witness to how reasonable you were being about it. Sophie made a small sound from the armchair, not quite a sob. Something closer to relief, the sound of a 15-year-old, finally hearing an adult say out loud the thing she'd been quietly carrying for 2 months. Bradley looked at his daughter, and for just a moment, something in his face cracked open in a way I hadn't seen since he was young enough to be genuinely, uncomplicatedly ashamed of himself. The studio's failing, Vanessa said, quietly now, not defending him anymore, so much as trying to understand the shape of what she'd married into. That much was true, Bradley. Was any of the rest of it true? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of the polish it carried in the earlier conversations. The first business folded because of decisions I made, not the market. I panicked. I took the money meaning to put it back before anyone noticed. Then I couldn't, and then it was easier to just let it be an error nobody chased down. He looked at me, and this time, I told myself it wasn't stealing if I was just asking early for something that was going to be mine eventually anyway. It was never only going to be yours, I said. Your mother made sure of that. She used to say guilt was expensive and never once bought anyone peace. I think she knew, even then, that someday I'd need reminding of that more than you would. Marcus Feld had gone very quiet on the far end of the couch, visibly recalculating whether his firm wanted any further association with this family's finances. He gathered his folder without a word and let himself out a few minutes later, which told me everything I needed to know about how much of his confidence had ever been more than performance. Denise stayed through what came next, mostly listening, occasionally clarifying a point of the trust language when Bradley tried, out of old habit, to argue his way around a clause instead of simply reckoning with it. But there was no argument left in the room that could undo 2 forged signatures and a paper trail 8 years deep. By the time Denise finally stood to leave, close to 8 o'clock, Bradley sat slumped on the couch with his head in his hands, and Vanessa sat a full cushion away from him, staring at nothing. I need you to leave for a while, Vanessa said to him quietly before Denise had even reached the door. Not shouted, not dramatic, just tired and finally certain. I need to figure out what I actually married, and I can't do that with you still sitting in the same room pretending this was ever about the studio. Bradley looked at me, and for one unguarded moment I saw something in his face that might have been the boy who built courthouses out of Lincoln logs. Scared, caught, wanting badly for someone to tell him it would be fine. I didn't tell him that. I couldn't, honestly, not that night. But I also didn't turn away from him, because 40 years of law had taught me the difference between refusing to enable someone and refusing to ever speak to them again, and I wasn't ready, even then, to choose the second one permanently. The days that followed were quiet, in a way the house hadn't been quiet in 2 months, not the old, aching quiet of grief, but something more like a held breath finally released. Bradley moved into a rented apartment across town within the week. Vanessa stayed at Birchwood Court a few more days with Sophie before finding her own place nearby, close enough that Sophie's school and life wouldn't be uprooted twice in one season. Denise and I spent the following weeks properly formalizing what should have been formalized 8 years earlier. A full accounting of the original withdrawal, a restitution schedule Bradley agreed to without contest, once the forensic evidence made contest pointless, and an updated trust structure that left no ambiguity for the next generation to exploit, intentionally or otherwise. I won't pretend that process was comfortable. There is no comfortable way to sit across a conference table from your own son while an examiner explains, in careful technical language, exactly how a forged signature differs from a genuine one. Sophie stayed close through all of it, in the particular way teenagers do when they've decided an adult has finally earned their trust, by telling the truth in front of them, instead of around them. She called most Sundays, the way her father used to before he stopped, and some Saturdays she came by Birchwood Court just to sit in the garage with me, sorting through the last of Eleanor's boxes, asking questions about her grandmother. I was only too glad to answer. Bradley wrote me a letter about 4 months after that Sunday meeting, 6 handwritten pages, no excuses folded into it, none of the reasonable-sounding language he'd used all spring. He admitted what he'd done, admitted how long he'd let the lie about the bank error sit undisturbed rather than face what it would cost him to correct it, admitted that, somewhere, in the last 2 months, he'd started believing his own justification so thoroughly that watching Sophie's face in that living room was the first moment it had actually sounded, out loud, as ugly as it actually was. He didn't ask me to forgive him in the letter. He asked, instead, whether I'd be willing to have coffee sometime, just the two of us, no documents on the table. I said yes, not because everything was resolved, it wasn't, and isn't, entirely, even now, but because Eleanor spent 39 years teaching me that boundaries and love aren't opposites, and that a father can hold his son accountable and still leave the door standing open a crack, provided the terms of walking back through it are honest ones. A year passed. Bradley completed the restitution schedule on time, every payment, without needing Denise's office to send a single reminder. His relationship with Vanessa did not survive the spring. They finalized their divorce quietly that winter, and Sophie split her time between 2 households that were, at least, no longer built on a lie either parent had to keep dressing up as concern. Bradley found steadier footing eventually, a smaller job with a smaller paycheck, and, from what I can tell, a good deal less performance in it than the life he'd been trying to finance at my expense. I still live at Birchwood Court. The porch still sags a half-inch on the left, and I've never once had it fixed, because some mornings I sit out there with my coffee and I can almost hear Eleanor telling me, "The house has honest bones," the same words she used the first day we walked through that empty living room 39 years ago. I understand that sentence differently now than I did the year she said it. I used to think she meant the house was solid. I think now she meant something closer to this. That honesty, in a family, is a structural thing, not a decorative one. The load-bearing wall you don't notice until someone tries to knock it down to make room for something they want more. Sophie is 16 now, and she wants to study law, which surprises no one who's watched her ask the right question at exactly the right moment for 2 years running. She tells me, sometimes, that watching that Sunday unfold taught her more about integrity than anything she's read in a classroom. I tell her honestly that I hope she never has to learn that particular lesson the hard way twice. Bradley and I have coffee most months now. We don't talk about the trust. We talk about Sophie's classes and the Cincinnati Reds and, occasionally, carefully, about his mother, who I think he understands now more fully than he ever managed to while she was alive to be understood. It isn't the relationship we had when he was 6 years old, sentencing stuffed rabbits to justice on my living room floor. It's something else, smaller in some ways, more honest in others, still under construction the way most worthwhile things are. Here's what I've learned. After 40 years of writing other families' protections into paper, and one very hard season learning I needed exactly that same protection in my own house. Love does not require you to hand over everything you've built the moment someone you love asks for it urgently enough. Family does not mean unlimited access to your accounts, your signature, or your judgment. Forgiveness and accountability are not opposites. You can hold someone to the full truth of what they did and still leave a door open for who they might become afterward. And if I can leave you with one more thing, read the fine print of your own life the way you'd read it in any contract, because the people who count on you not to are usually the ones asking you to sign the fastest. If you were in my position, would you have called your former partner the way I did, or handled it privately within the family first? I'd really like to know. Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there tonight. I read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps stories like this reach the people who might need to hear them most.